All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating today. We're taking a deep dive into the supernatural, specifically some personal experiences that you shared with us. I gotta say, they really piqued my curiosity.
Well, it's really interesting. These experiences, they can feel so real,
Yeah.
And yet they totally defy our everyday understanding of the world, like that premonition you had about the car accident, right?
Right.
And how that led you to choose a safer vehicle.
Exactly. It's like you just knew something wasn't right.
Mm.
And it wasn't just that one time either. You also mentioned that premonition about your grandfather's passing when you were a child. That must have been really tough to process at such a young age.
It was.
Especially because, from what I understand, there wasn't any obvious reason to think that anything was wrong at the time.
That's right. And on top of those, there's that feeling you described of like a supernatural power influencing your musical creativity, which honestly, I think a lot of artists throughout history have probably felt that same thing.
It's like tapping into something bigger than ourselves, right? Almost like a source of inspiration that we can't fully explain.
Definitely.
So I was thinking, before we really get into your specific experiences, it might be helpful to just define what we even mean by supernatural,
Yeah.
right? So what are your thoughts on that? How would you define it?
Well, I think the term supernatural generally refers to those phenomena that seem to go beyond what we currently understand scientifically,
Yeah.
And it's really important to remember that just because we can't explain something yet, it doesn't automatically make it real or fake. It just means we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle figured out yet.
Okay. So it's like a placeholder for all the stuff that science is still trying to catch up to.
Mm-hmm.
And in your research, have you come across any specific theories or frameworks that try to explain these types of experiences? Like I'm thinking of things like Carl Jung's concept of synchronicity, or maybe even some of the research being done in parapsychology.
Oh, definitely. Jung's synchronicity, for instance, suggests that events that might seem totally unrelated can actually be meaningfully connected by some underlying principle that we don't necessarily see.
Mm-hmm.
And then in parapsychology, there's been quite a bit of research into ESP, extrasensory perception, right?
Right.
Which includes things like telepathy and clairvoyance.
So it seems like there's this whole spectrum of possibilities when we're talking about these things.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your premonitions.
Okay.
Let's start with the car accident.
Mm-hmm.
I read that you suddenly felt this urge to rent a sturdier vehicle, even though you had initially planned on getting a smaller car.
Yes. And that decision, it was based on this feeling I had. I couldn't really explain it, but it potentially saved me from getting really seriously injured.
Wow.
Because the car I had originally wanted, the smaller one, it ended up being involved in this huge multi-car collision.
Oh, wow.
Like just a few hours after I would have been driving it.
That's pretty chilling when you think about it like that.
It is.
Have you ever thought that maybe your subconscious was picking up on some cues that your conscious mind was just missing? I was reading about some research that suggests our brains are always kind of processing information, even on a level that we're not even aware of. And sometimes that information can kind of, surface as those gut feelings or intuitions that we have.
That's definitely possible. There's a lot more research coming out now in neuroscience that supports that.
Right.
Like, for instance, those studies they do on micro expressions?
Yeah.
Well, they've shown that we can actually subconsciously pick up on these really, really subtle facial cues. And those cues can actually reveal a person's true emotional state, even if they're trying really hard to hide it.
So maybe you were subconsciously noticing something about the person at the rental car counter.
Maybe.
Or maybe there were some subtle environmental cues that you were picking up on without realizing it, like the weather conditions or the traffic reports or something like that just triggered this sense of unease in you.
It's definitely possible. Our brains are incredible at recognizing patterns.
Right.
It's conceivable that we are actually processing way more information than we even realize. And then sometimes that information, it just bubbles up to the surface in the form of these feelings that we can't explain.
That makes me wonder if maybe these premonitions aren't so much about literally predicting the future, but more about our subconscious kind of trying to warn us about potential dangers.
I think that's a really insightful way to look at it.
Yeah.
It's almost like our intuition is acting as this early warning system, right?
Yeah.
And it's prompting us to pay attention to those subtle cues that we might otherwise just totally miss.
Like that saying, trust your gut.
Exactly.
But let's move on to the premonition about your grandfather. You mentioned experiencing this when you were pretty young.
Mm-hmm.
And some people believe that children are just more open to these kinds of experiences.
Hmm.
I even read a study that suggested that children's brains might actually be wired for like greater sensitivity to subtle energy fields, whatever those are.
Hmm.
So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's any truth to that idea?
It's really fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, children, they often haven't developed the same filters or that same skepticism that adults have,
Right.
So maybe they're more receptive to information that's coming from sources that aren't traditional, whether it's subtle energy fields or simply just heightened emotional sensitivity. Children just seem to perceive the world differently than we do as adults.
And you're particularly close to your grandfather, right?
I was.
So maybe that strong emotional bond somehow amplified your sensitivity to his well-being, even from a distance. Like, is that something you've considered?
It's definitely possible. We know that strong emotions can have a huge impact on how we perceive things and our awareness in general. So maybe that deep connection that I had with him allowed me to pick up on subtle cues about how he was doing. Like, I don't know, maybe changes in his energy or even his voice over the phone that other people just didn't notice.
It's almost like your intuition was this bridge between the two of you,
Mm-hmm.
even though you were physically separated. And it seems like these experiences, while they're mysterious, they also kind of highlight the incredible power of our minds and the depth of our connections with others, I think.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to the fascinating connection between your music and this concept of the flow state, which I'd love to explore further.
Yes. I'm really curious to delve into that. You mentioned feeling like you're channeling something beyond yourself when you create music.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard other artists describe similar experiences. Is this something that's come up in your research as well?
Oh, absolutely. The flow state. It's something that a psychologist named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described. And it's basically a state of deep focus. You're so immersed in what you're doing that your actions and your awareness just kind of merge together. And it's often associated with like peak performance and creativity. And a lot of artists, musicians, athletes report feeling a sense of effortlessness, like
Right.
timelessness, and even a connection to something bigger than themselves when they're in that state.
That actually reminds me of something you mentioned in your notes. You were really intrigued by the concept of synchronicity,
Right.
and especially how it relates to your musical experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So in your research, have you found any connections between flow state and synchronicity?
Well, what's so fascinating is that both flow state and synchronicity, they both point towards this idea that our minds are capable of tapping into patterns and connections, stuff that might not be obvious to us on a conscious level. So in flow state, we get so absorbed in that creative process that we lose track of time. We lose self-consciousness. And then in synchronicity, we experience those seemingly meaningful coincidences that suggest that there's this, I don't know, like a hidden order or interconnectedness in the universe.
Yeah. It's like those moments when everything just clicks.
Right.
The ideas just flow effortlessly. You're completely in the zone. And it almost feels like the music is writing itself.
Exactly. And in those moments, it's easy to feel like you're channeling something outside of yourself, like some source of creative energy that's both within you, but also somehow transcends your own individual limitations.
Wow. That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
But how do we access this flow state more often? Is it just about talent and inspiration?
Yeah.
Or are there practical steps we can take to cultivate these supernatural creative breakthroughs?
Well, I think talent and inspiration definitely play a part, but there are definitely techniques that can help. One of the most important is just consistent practice. The more you actually engage in your craft, the more you develop the skills and the muscle memory that allow you to enter that state of flow more easily.
So it's not about just waiting for the muse to strike. It's about showing up and doing the work consistently.
Exactly. And it's also important to create an environment that is conducive to flow.
Okay.
So that might mean minimizing distractions, setting clear goals for yourself, or just finding a space where you feel comfortable and inspired.
So practice, environment, what else? You mentioned in your notes that meditation can be helpful. Is that right?
Yes. Meditation can be a very powerful tool for cultivating flow. By calming the mind, focusing our attention, we can reduce that mental chatter and create a sense of inner stillness. And that can be like a gateway to those moments of deep creative immersion.
I've tried meditating before, but I often find it hard to really quiet my mind. Do you have any tips for beginners?
Yeah. One simple technique is to just focus on your breath. Notice the sensation of each inhale and each exhale. And don't judge your thoughts. Just observe them as they come and go, like clouds in the sky.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So we're not trying to stop the flow of thoughts. We're just trying to create space where we're not completely swept away by them.
Exactly. And with practice, you can actually train your mind to become more focused, more present, which is beneficial not just for creativity, but for everything in life.
It seems like we've been focusing a lot on the positive aspects of these experiences, but I imagine there could also be some downsides, especially when we're talking about things like premonitions. I mean, if you're constantly feeling foreboding or anxiety, that could be pretty debilitating, couldn't it?
Yeah, that's a really important point. While intuition can be a valuable guide, it's super important to be discerning. We don't want to let fear or anxiety just totally dictate our actions. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Listening to our inner voice while also maintaining a healthy perspective.
So it's not about becoming a slave to our intuitions. It's more about learning how to integrate them into our decision-making process.
Exactly.
In a way that empowers us rather than just overwhelms us.
Precisely. And that's where journaling can be so helpful. By keeping a record of your intuitive experiences, you can start to identify patterns. And you can also track which of your intuitions actually turn out to be accurate and which ones might be influenced by other factors, like stress or wishful thinking.
So it's like becoming your own researcher, in a way, gathering data, analyzing patterns, and using that information to refine those intuitive skills.
Exactly. By taking that more objective and analytical approach, we can learn to trust our intuition without becoming overly reliant on it or letting it completely control our lives.
Okay, so practice, environment, meditation, journaling. These are some really great practical tips, for anyone who's looking to tap into those supernatural abilities. But I have to ask, do you think everyone has the potential to experience these things, like the premonitions and flow states? Or are some people just naturally more gifted?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's one that people have been debating for centuries. While some people might have a natural predisposition toward these experiences, I personally believe that everyone has the potential to develop their intuitive and creative abilities. It's like a muscle. It gets stronger through practice and attention.
So it's not about being special or chosen. It's about recognizing that we all have these innate capacities within us, just waiting to be awakened.
Exactly. And by embracing curiosity, cultivating a sense of wonder, and being open to exploring the unknown, we can unlock those hidden potentials and discover a world of possibilities that we might never have imagined.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like we've covered so much ground today, from premonitions and synchronicity to flow states and the power of the subconscious mind. But before we wrap things up, I wanted to kind of circle back to that big question we posed earlier. Is it just circumstance, or is there something more to these experiences? It really feels like we've been going back and forth on this question of whether these experiences are just random things that happen, but what if they're pointing to something bigger, something we don't fully understand yet?
Yeah. I think it could be both, honestly.
Okay.
We've talked about how our brains are constantly processing information, even picking up on tiny cues that we're not always aware of. So, there's definitely a scientific explanation for why we might experience things like premonitions or gut feelings.
Right, like all that research on microexpressions that we talked about.
Exactly.
But even with those explanations, it still feels like there's this mystery lingering. You know what I mean? Like, where do those subconscious insights actually come from? Are we tapping into some kind of collective unconscious? Or is there maybe even some aspect of reality that we just haven't grasped yet?
That's what's so cool about this whole thing, right? Even as we keep digging deeper into the science of the mind, into the nature of reality, there are always going to be questions that push us to the edge of what we know. And I think that's where the real magic is. In that space where science and mystery meet.
I love that. The intersection of science and mystery. It actually makes me think about all the things we just take for granted in the world today, like electricity or the internet. 100 years ago, that stuff would seem like straight up magic to people.
Right.
So who knows what crazy discoveries are waiting for us out there as we explore things like consciousness and human potential.
Exactly. What we consider supernatural today could be totally normal tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think your experiences, the premonitions, the creative flow, it all suggests that we're capable of way more than we realize.
It's like we all have these incredible superpowers, but we haven't quite figured out how to use them yet.
That's a perfect way to put it. And I think the key to unlocking those superpowers is to really cultivate awareness, trust our intuition, and just embrace the unknown.
So for someone who wants to start developing their intuition, start tapping into their creative potential, what advice would you give them? Where do they even begin?
Well, first and foremost, I would say just pay attention to that inner voice,
Okay.
Notice those gut feelings, those moments of insight, those weird little synchronicities.
Mm.
Don't just write them off as coincidence or imagination. Write them down. Reflect on them. And see if you can spot any patterns.
And you mentioned journaling before as a good way to keep track of those experiences and help us understand our intuition a little better.
Right. Journaling is a really powerful tool for self-discovery. It helps us step back and look at our thoughts, feelings, and experiences from a more objective point of view. And over time, by tracking our intuitions, we can start to see which ones are usually right on target and which ones might be influenced by other things going on.
So it's kind of like we're training our intuitive muscles, trying to figure out how to tell the difference between the real deal and just noise.
Exactly.
And what about meditation? You talked about that as a way to cultivate those flow states.
Yeah, meditation can be super helpful for calming the mind, reducing stress,
Mm-hmm.
and just becoming more aware of those subtle energies and those intuitive nudges we get. Even just a few minutes every day can make a huge difference.
Okay, so pay attention to your intuition, journal your experiences, meditate. Those are some really good starting points. But what about those times when we feel stuck,
Mm-hmm.
like the creative juices just aren't flowing? Any tips for dealing with those creative blocks?
One thing that I find really helps is to just change my surroundings. Go for
Mm.
a walk out in nature, visit a museum, listen to some different music, anything that shakes up your routine a little bit and it exposes you to new things.
Like hitting the reset button on your mind.
Exactly. And don't forget about playfulness
Yeah.
and experimentation. Sometimes we get so caught up in trying to be perfect or trying to achieve a certain result that we end up stifling our own creativity.
Hmm.
It's important to remember that creativity thrives on exploration.
Yeah.
Trying new things, making mistakes, and just having fun with it.
It's like giving ourselves permission to be a beginner again, approaching things with that childlike sense of wonder
Mm-hmm.
and curiosity.
Exactly. When we let go of the need to control everything, we open ourselves up to so many more possibilities, and that's where the real magic happens.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive into the world of the supernatural. We've explored premonitions, intuition, flow states, and so much more. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of the power of the human mind and all the mysteries that are out there.
It's been a real pleasure exploring these topics with you. And remember, this is really just the beginning of your journey. The more you pay attention to that inner world, the more you trust your intuition, the more you embrace those things you don't understand, the more you'll discover the incredible potential that you have inside you.
And for our listeners out there, if this has inspired you to want to learn more about these things, remember that you're not alone. There are tons of resources available. Books, articles, podcasts, communities, all dedicated to exploring the mysteries of consciousness and human potential. So keep an open mind, stay curious, and trust in the power of the unknown. The world is full of wonder and magic just waiting to be discovered. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the supernatural. Until next time, keep exploring, keep wondering, and keep believing in the power of the extraordinary.
This is DigitView.